I'm Olivia Jones, 26, standing at the back of a rented banquet hall in a black dress while violinists hush mid-note. Janet Brooks, the county registrar, flips through the certified copies I just handed her and looks up like she's found a live wire. Harper Jones, my sister, stalls halfway down the aisle in my wedding dress, clutching Michael Carter, her groom. Pastor Henry Blake lowers his book and the music drops to a silence. Proceedings are halted, Janet says into her lapel mic, and ushers glance at Sophie Lane, the planner, for instructions that won't come. I don't raise my voice, I don't explain. I let the stamped seals speak while Mom, who always has a line ready, finally runs out of words. Before I tell you exactly how I stopped that wedding cold and why even Mom went silent, tell me where you're listening from in the comments. I see them all. Subscribe and switch on notifications for more family revenge stories that end with consequences, not apologies. I was the second born, present, useful, the child who could be moved to the side without anyone noticing a missing piece. I learned early to make space for Harper because praise came when I smoothed conflicts, ran errands, and adjusted my wants without being asked. Mom would say, "You're resilient," and she sounded proud, but I knew what that meant. Resilient meant you did without. Dad never corrected the pattern. He called it keeping the peace and suggested I pick my battles. I learned to pick none. When Harper needed help, I bent. When I needed anything, I folded it small and put it inside my pocket until it fit the outline of the life they expected me to live. Being useful kept me visible in a way that let people ignore me. I was the one teachers praised for being reliable, the one the coach put on cleanup duty, the one who stayed late to help Harper rehearse speeches. It didn't feel like erasure so much as training. You do the behind-the-scenes things and you get the quiet approval. I learned to solve problems silently. My competence meant I was assumed competent but not ambitious. It made me invisible in the places where ambition earns credit. I started keeping lists not as a boast but as a ledger: dates, conversations, casual mentions. Those lists would become my evidence later, but at the time they were just habits. They were the small rituals I used to hold myself steady in a house that preferred my stillness to my voice. Public dismissal arrived in tiny, stinging ways. In middle school, I stood at the front of the auditorium to accept an award, and Mom, in that loud, performative way she has, leaned in and said, "Don't look so proud, your sister presents next." The laughter that followed wasn't cruel. It was a lesson in how to shrink without being punished. At a neighborhood barbecue, I tried to explain a group project I'd led, and Mom told the table I was sensitive, as if sensitivity explains away competence. Harper would roll her eyes and tell people I overthink, and I would laugh because it was easier than correcting the record in public. I learned to read a room: who had power, who echoed Mom, who might be kind. Visibility got you labeled. Invisibility let you be left alone. I started journaling dates, words, reactions, not because I planned to use them, but because I needed something in ink that wouldn't change if they did. Harper's pedestal was more than family preference, it was structural. Mom curated Harper's life like a portfolio: school captain, volunteer hours, summer internships that looked good on applications, and I was the staff who made the show run. Harper's needs arrived as directives. "Olivia, can you drive her? Olivia, can you fix this? Olivia, be nice." When Harper stumbled, when she missed a deadline or hurt someone's feelings, I was the one asked to clean the edges, quietly, quickly, with no credit. Any friction became my flaw. "Don't make this harder than it is," Mom would say when I complained about being sidelined. I took that to heart. I internalized that my best work was the work no one noticed. The family had a script, and I was taught to be the understudy who never took the stage. Mom invested in Harper's image and in the telling of a family story where Harper was the promise and I was the supporting cast. It meant that when it came to big decisions, my preferences could be reallocated without much fuss. My life became a set of checkboxes someone else could mark for me. The word unstable became the weapon they used when erasing me needed justification. In high school, I had a panic episode after a coach screamed at me. Mom framed it to relatives as episodes, and the language stuck. She would tell strangers in grocery lines, "Olivia gets overwhelmed," as if public announcements could change private reality. Each time she repeated it, the narrative solidified. I went to therapy and Mom treated appointments like evidence against me, not progress supporting me. Dad would tell me, "Don't make waves," when I tried to explain the difference between anxiety and incapacity, as if a calm surface is the same as stability. I taught myself to manage my breathing and my face better than anyone else in the house because appearance mattered more than truth. Therapy notes, journal entries, medical receipts, small, boring things became the lattice I would later use to hold up my claim to competence. For years, every time I spoke up, I met the unstable brush-off. It saved them the trouble of arguing and made my protests sound like symptoms instead of substance. I learned to be precise with my words and to document the people who described me as fragile so that if I ever needed to prove I wasn't, I would have the map of how they'd built the lie. At the same time, Dad never outright defended Mom when she rewrote facts to her liking. He'd look at the floor and I remember the way his shoulders rounded, that familiar resignation. Behind closed doors, he'd apologize in small ways. "You know how your mother is," and hand over a piece of the truth. He'd quietly admit that Mom could be excessive and overbearing, but in public he wouldn't interrupt her narrative. He said once, after one of my more pointed questions, "I don't want more trouble," and that phrasing did more damage than any shout. It told me to expect minimal rescue and to plan my exits accordingly. Dad's quiet complicity also meant access. He was the one who'd listen if I needed to vent and then tuck a copy of a contract into his truck glove box. He'd retrieve a receipt from a junk drawer and say, "You should keep this," as if offering a tool rather than a confession. That is why, when I finally needed a tangible ally, he could be one, but only if I asked without dramatics. He taught me the value of small, practical help over big declarations. In a family that preferred argument to accountability, Dad's small actions were the only steady currency. They didn't fix everything, but they gave me the ability to collect proof and not only rely on my memory when the world tried to tell a different story. I built a life anyway. There is a particular comfort in small, well-ordered things: the neatness of my apartment, the way my shelves line up, the two light switches by my bed that each control a different mood. I worked through college, balancing nights of shift work at a coffee shop with mornings of lectures and afternoons buried in project management textbooks. I studied systems. How people fail, how processes break down, how a checklist can stop chaos from becoming catastrophe. That training was not glamorous, it was methodical and practical. I learned how to map dependencies, how to schedule deadlines, how to assign accountability. It felt almost surgical to bring order to messy human situations. I chose friends who liked me steady and reliable, not dramatic or attention-seeking. Lisa became my calibrator, the one who would say, "That's petty," or "That's important," and mean it. She was honest, technical, and discreet. She saw patterns I missed and told me when to sharpen my questions. I cultivated habits that later mattered legally: saving receipts, time-stamping correspondence, photographing package labels, logging phone calls. I learned to ask for written confirmations and to never rely on a voicemail as the only record. My apartment was spare on purpose. The clean surfaces calmed the chaos that family could create. I kept a fire-safe box for documents people in my life sometimes said didn't exist. I didn't parade my competence, I stored it. It felt necessary, like keeping an emergency kit in the trunk. You hope you never need it, but you're glad it's there when the car breaks down on a late-night road. Then Jason arrived, quietly and with an easy laugh that didn't try to rearrange my life. He liked that I knew what I wanted and didn't shout about it. We met at a mutual friend's dinner. He was wearing a blue sweater that made his eyes look younger, and he asked me about a book I'd mentioned in passing. We talked late into the night about simple things we both liked: gardening, mid-century architecture, the right angle for a hanging photo frame. There was no fireworks barrage, no dramatic declarations. He proposed in a way that felt like us, small, clear, and deliberate. We agreed on a short engagement because we both wanted to move forward without dragging out the logistics. We decided on a simple ceremony, a garden venue with a rain plan, close friends, short toasts, a silk A-line dress I loved that fit like a second skin. I involved Mom lightly at first, phone calls that ended with clear boundaries. I limited vendor access, set firm budgets, and picked dates that made sense for both of our schedules. That careful planning was, to me, an act of love. Harper offered to help with the vibe, which I took as sisterly. When she pushed, I said no. I did it kindly, which irritated Mom. For the first time, there was a plan that felt like mine, a timeline I had written, deposits paid from my account, a list of vendors emailed and confirmed. I liked the work of planning, it fit with my project management habits. I sent contracts and saved PDFs and printed confirmations, stacking them like bricks to make something solid. We talked about who mattered at the ceremony and why. We chose our maid of honor not because she was loudest, but because she would hold a pen steady. Jason and I made choices that centered consent and clarity. The officiant we picked had experience with civil ceremonies. The venue manager agreed in writing to our timeline, and every vendor received an itemized schedule. I kept Mom in a limited role because I knew her ability to take over. Harper offered to help again, and I declined again with a smile, saying, "I've got a vision." That moment, more than any other, seems small in memory, but it was when the line was drawn. I expected friction, certainly, but I did not expect a full-scale reallocation of my life. Pressure began like a slow leak. Mom suggested merging guest lists for efficiency and then started making calls that sounded helpful but were anything but. She phoned Jason privately and painted me as spiraling over trivial details, and when he called me to check, I answered with steady facts, which only seemed to make him more anxious. Harper floated moving her own wedding up a bit, casually aligning it with my date as if calendars were flexible and my plans were not. Mom told the venue there had been a compassionate change and in the same breath began to imply I was too fragile to manage. One evening, I called to confirm a final deposit and discovered the planner, Sophie, had CC'd Harper on emails meant for me. The pattern began to look like coordination. I started documenting because habits die hard. I logged calls and wrote down the times people contacted vendors. I revoked any verbal authorizations I might have once given and requested written confirmations everywhere. But the pressure was subtle and coordinated. Mom's voice carried a kind of authority with vendors who had always liked her. She framed requests as family decisions. Sophie began to forward invoices with Harper's initials. A seamstress texted me that my fitting had been moved and then said, "It's for Harper," as if the switch was a courtesy. I felt a cold clarity settle. This was not accidental, it was organized and it had a direction. The vendors started to silently reassign themselves like ducks shifting lanes in a river. The florist sent a message that read, confirming the change of bride, and when I responded they apologized and said Mom had assured them the switch was approved. The caterer forwarded a revised proposal with Harper's name at the top. When I called, the representative read from notes from Olivia's mother as though they were relaying a family memo. The seamstress texted, "Your fitting is now next week for Harper," and when I went to the boutique I found my dress on Harper's rack with pins still in the hem. The boutique owner said Mom had called to explain that I was unwell and that it would be easier to transfer things to Harper. Each one of these exchanges felt like a small theft, and yet they were being done with an efficiency that suggested forethought. I froze my card on every wedding vendor and asked for itemized ledgers, but the responses were defensive. Sophie claimed it was all a miscommunication and offered to sort it, which increasingly translated to "nothing will change." I started getting text messages from cousins with save the dates that mirrored my color palette and my date but listed Harper's name. My spreadsheets began to show odd activity. Someone had exported my guest list from our shared drive. I changed passwords and set up two-factor authentication, but the damage had a head start. Vendors cited a family representative as having authority and implicitly permission to move money and dates. It was methodical and deliberate, and it looked like a power play designed to make me invisible in my own life. My maid of honor texted me that she'd been asked to stand for Harper on the same day with a tone that tried to be helpful. "They said Olivia needs rest," she wrote. The words heard on their own, the implication was worse. Jason's parents called me confused and said they'd received an invitation addressed from my address book. I asked how, and they read me a name, Jones Family. It sounded like an address label, like a protocol, and it meant someone had accessed my contacts. I pried my shared drive open and found a CSV download sitting in the trash folder. Someone had exported it, then tried to remove the evidence. I downloaded the file for myself, printed it, and circled the entries. I revoked access to shared files, set up two-factor authentication, and changed passwords. I emailed every person on the guest list privately to apologize for the chaos and to confirm their RSVP. A few responded with worry, asking if I was all right. Some wrote that they'd assumed the swap was intentional, that families did this sometimes to avoid waste. Their casualness felt like betrayal. I pulled up my phone and called the venue manager. He hesitated, then said, "We were approached by a family representative." I asked who, and he named Mom. Hearing her voice on that file, authoritative and smooth, made my skin prickle. She had presented herself as guardian of the family narrative and received vendor cooperation in return. The spreadsheet was a wound I could see. I started to stitch. Then came a call from the venue. "We received confirmation from your mother that you are canceling." The words landed with a thud. They said it with the same corporate calm as someone confirming a refund. I asked to speak to the person who made the confirmation. The manager read from an email, Mom's email, stating that I would not be able to proceed because I was unwell and the family wanted to transfer the booking to Harper. The deposit had been declared non-refundable but transferable, and according to the contract, transfer was possible when the client agreed. Mom had signed as the primary contact. I remember the sound of my own breath, the mechanical way I asked for the contract copy and the dates of transfers. He sent a PDF. My name was not on the final signature line. I wrote a formal dispute letter that afternoon and printed it with every receipt I had. I sat at my kitchen table and read it aloud like a witness preparing testimony. I recorded the date and time of every vendor call, the name of the person who answered. I asked the manager to reverse the transfer and was told slowly that without a court order it would be difficult. Mom called later and said, "Be grateful your sister can use it since you can't handle the stress." She didn't raise her voice, she didn't need to, her pity was the thing that finished the job. Jason called me after that, his voice thin. He asked for a week to let the dust settle. He sounded frightened, not cruel. It was an answer that made sense. When the people around you believe a narrative, they act as if it's true. I felt the old script, my life being repurposed under the guise of care, and I stopped arguing. I started archiving. Silence from Jason came in stages. At first it was calls that went straight to voicemail. Then it was a text every few days that read like a news update rather than a conversation. His sister told me apologetically that Mom had called their house and explained that I'd had a breakdown and needed space. Rumors are interesting in how they migrate. They begin as empathy and harden into fact. People are inclined to give those they love the benefit of the doubt. His boss heard I'd taken leave, untrue, but it added gravity. One evening, I drove to the cafe where we'd planned to meet and sat with my phone face down. The table smelled like coffee and sugar, and the napkin dispenser light reflected in the glass. I told myself to breathe. He postponed our meeting, then postponed again, and each postponement carried weight. "There's pressure from all sides," he said, as if he were a boat in a storm he had no sails to use. I wrote him a letter because I needed to place civility on record. No begging, no recrimination, facts, timelines, copies of invoices, statements of hurt. I left a copy at his office desk, polite and precise, and sent a sealed email. He read it but did not respond. Silence is an answer. I learned that when someone steps back because the world is telling them to protect themselves, they pull others with them. I sat with that and kept writing. Sophie's behavior evolved from denials to a final shuffle that smelled of weaseling. When I requested Sophie's contract, it was signed by Joan's family with Mom's card on file. When I pointed that out, Sophie said with faux confusion, "Your mother is the primary client. She's always handled family events." She knew precisely what she was saying. Emails resurfaced where Sophie had CC'd Harper on vendor conversations and where she had forwarded my confirmations to Mom without my consent. I assembled them into a folder and watched the pattern appear like a photograph developing in a dark room. When I escalated and mentioned a formal complaint, Sophie wrote back with a long, anxious message about keeping the family happy and avoiding additional charges. It read like someone trying to maintain business while protecting reputation. I sent a demand for an itemized ledger and the original signed change order that transferred my deposit. She hesitated and then ghosted for 2 days until I CC'd the venue manager and the seamstress. Suddenly, she surfaced with a bland apology and an attachment labeled Final Confirmations. It contained Harper's run of show, my vendors, my date, and a note that said, "Per client's instruction, we're proceeding with Harper." It was a final shuffle, an attempt to wash everything into a single tidy narrative where the family acted as one. The shuffle felt like the closing of a hand around my plan, trying to make it vanish. After that, I stopped trying to win conversations that were never meant to be honest. I went to Mom's house with contracts folded in my tote and asked a single, simple question. "What did you tell Jason?" We were in the living room where the wallpaper had a pattern of pale leaves and Dad's chair squeaked when he shifted. Mom was at the center as if this were a stage she had set. She looked at me with that clinical calm she reserves for speeches and said, without seeming cruel, "You're too mentally unstable to get married." The room seemed to pause. Harper sat nearby, legs crossed, an expression of relief like somebody taking a seat they felt they'd earned. Michael's hand hovered near hers. Dad lowered his head. He had the look he always had in these moments, the way he made himself small so the house could stay standing. I watched him choose silence over correction again. I felt the air in the room get thinner, like the house was pulling back its support to see what would happen. I had packed evidence, but I also had the sudden understanding that there would be no persuasion left in that room for me. I tried to explain, my voice even, "That's not true." Mom amplified the claim with examples, therapy visits, a panic episode years ago, my supposed difficulty making decisions. They offered these as facts, not context. I didn't argue the point. There was a kind of economy to it that day. I folded my papers with the same methodical calm I used for everything else, put my tote on my shoulder and said, "Understood." That was the last time I tried to persuade them of anything. I left quietly. The front door clicked behind me like a verdict. In the car, I let myself breathe fully for the first time in days and felt the build of something that was not grief but a hardening resolve. I called Lisa and said, "I need a weekend and a whiteboard." She came with takeout and a pitcher of coffee. We mapped the timeline from the first CC'd email to the brunch, circling the word unstable in thick black ink and writing weapon next to it. There was no melodrama, no begging, just lists, receipts, and a plan. I put my phone in a drawer, opened a legal pad, and began to plot not a plea but a prosecution, an exercise in method and timing that would, if executed, make their narrative impossible to live in. Mom tapped her glass and the room quieted by degrees, not all at once. There's an economy to that moment. People stop chewing, they set down forks, they lean in. She thanked everyone for supporting Olivia through this fragile time and announced with an even tone that there had been a compassionate transition to Harper's wedding. It was rehearsed, the kind of speech that wrapped a decision in care so it wouldn't look like theft. I didn't speak. My hand stayed on the folder because there is a comfort to paper that shoulder-deep accusations don't break. The florist smiled in the way people do when they want to stay in business. The venue rep made a small note on a legal pad. Around us, the clatter of plates picked up and the servers kept moving like they always do in busy rooms, polishing normalcy. I watched the faces at the table. Some relatives nodded as if they had already filed this choice under helpful. A cousin I barely know kept glancing at me as if looking for permission to take a side. Sophie rattled off logistical reassurances in a soft voice that meant, "Everything will be fine," and the word fine felt like a closing lid. The whole scene had the curated calm of a public relations meeting. My folder made me feel anchored. I kept my mouth shut because any sound from me could be reframed as evidence. So I learned to listen instead, cataloging names, times, the cadence of Mom's sentences. It was all being made public, and that publicity was part of their strategy. They were moving my life in full view because shame works better when it's visible. When I said, "I did not cancel my wedding," Mom raised her voice enough to carry over cutlery and said, "You are too mentally unstable to get married." The room stopped. Silverware paused halfway to mouths, a glass tilted and steadied by an extended hand. It landed like an accusation thrown into a quiet pond, rings spreading. Mom listed behaviors as if reading from a file. My therapy sessions, a panic episode from high school, the way I sometimes asked for time to decide. She turned traits into proof. Harper looked at me without shame, almost like she'd been relieved to have permission. Michael kept his gaze on his water glass, fingers tracing the rim. The venue rep in his suit shifted and said, in the tone of someone who has to protect a business, "If a family representative canceled, we can't reverse without penalties." The words weren't mean. They were efficient. I remember breathing slowly then, deliberately, because the moment needed to be recorded in my body exactly as it happened. When people file memories later, they need to find the copy you saved. I let the sentence sit where it would, in air, in records, in the heads of those watching. I didn't try to unmake Mom's sentence. I didn't argue the facts into the open because she had already framed the narrative with care. Instead, I folded my hands around my folder like a small shield and listened to the room reinterpret me. Their pity hit like acid. Their pity was a public performance. I felt something change under me, like a floorboard snapping from years of weight, and I knew the way forward would not be in pleadings. Harper announced that she'd already had the dress altered to save Olivia the trouble, and an aunt clapped as if a good deed had been done. The seamstress smoothed the air with a polite smile. An aunt I don't like looked at me with that thin paternal pity that feels more like judgment than sympathy. I stood up, gathered my documents, and said with my voice steady, "Thank you all for coming." Mom, close enough to be overheard, leaned to the manager and said, "Make sure she's okay to get to her car," and 2 staff members hovered at a distance like watchful shepherds. It read like concern but functioned like an escort. The manager's face held the kind of practiced empathy meant to be comforting. He offered a glass of water with the efficiency of someone trained in diffusing awkwardness. Servers rounded the table with little bows and averted eyes, moving me to the edge of the room. I could feel heads turn as I passed. A fork clinked louder than it needed to. The air smelled of lemon meringue and coffee, and every normal scent felt sharpened into detail when your life is being rewritten. I walked past them, quiet and precise, and outside the sun hit my face. I got into my car and let myself breathe once, as if the act of closing the door might keep the room's news story from following me. I did not shout. I did not cry in front of people who had already made the decision about me. I drove away with my silence intact, the fabric of the dress they had taken still folded in my mind like a bruise. I let myself collapse once I was alone. In the car, I closed my eyes and let whatever had been held back come. The tears took their place, quick and hot, and then they stopped when I told myself to stop. There's a limited usefulness to catharsis in that state. It clears the brain for a task. I called Lisa and said, "I need a weekend and a whiteboard," and she came with coffee and a battered notebook like a paramedic arriving with precise tools. I hid behind a pad of paper and began the work of translation, what they had done, what they had said, where their words could be countered with documents. There is a particular cruelty to having your emotional life used as currency. It buys you the appearance of helplessness and takes your real choices. I scrubbed my social accounts with the careful touch of someone defusing a bomb. Privacy settings tightened, posts hidden, wedding photos archived offline. I emailed my human resources department for 2 days of time off and cited urgent family logistics because the truth was messier and would invite more interpretations. I put my phone in a drawer and began a timeline from the first vendor email to the brunch. At line 14, I drew a box around the word unstable and wrote the word weapon in thick black ink. I made lists. Who had access to what, who had been contacted, who had signed what. At the end of the day, I folded the timeline into an envelope and placed it on the kitchen counter. The act of sorting facts felt like putting armor on. I replaced explaining with confirmation. I sat down and wrote a short list of new rules for myself. No explaining in public, no pleading for sympathy, no trying to persuade anyone who had decided already. I traded words such as convince for confirm, argue for document, and react for plan. I wrote 3 objectives on the top of a fresh sheet: halt Harper's ceremony, neutralize Mom's narrative, and establish an official record. Under that, I added a constraint: no screaming, no public scenes, and no begging. I decided it would be public, legal, and timed. Those simple lines felt clarifying, like a map laid out at my feet. Planning felt like breathing again. There was also a cost to adopting this rule. I knew it meant I could lose people who had a stake in my being flattened. I knew that some friends would be uncomfortable with legal measures or with making troubles public. I practiced sentences in the mirror that were short and factual. This is the documentation, or I will give the evidence to the registrar. I rehearsed walking into a room, placing documents on a table, and walking out. I promised myself that I would not be baited into theatrics because theatrics were the very thing my family used to write me off. I would be precise. I would be calm. I would let the evidence speak so loudly that pity could no longer be used as an excuse to override facts. That rule felt like a liberation: no more explaining, only proving. I started by replaying memory like tape. Harper said she'd gone on a paperwork errand to a border city and came back with cash and a new phone. She'd said she was helping a friend and laughed it off when Mom asked. Those little evasions suddenly looked like markers. I dug through airline receipts I could access, emails about a round-trip, boarding passes we'd once printed for her when we were all traveling to a cousin's wedding. Photo metadata from a Snapchat she sent me once held a geotag I hadn't noticed before. It pointed to a municipal registry in a town just across the border. I knew I needed someone local who could ask official questions without tipping Harper off. Lisa found Anna Duarte, a consular services translator who did record requests and spoke both English and Spanish. I paid Anna to go to the registry in person and ask about Harper Jones. It felt risky, like poking a hornet's nest, but the domestic data was my only lead. Anna called back 2 days later and read me a list. A civil marriage certificate, names, dates, and a signature. Hearing it over the phone made everything concrete. I asked her to secure a certified copy and to get an apostille so the document would be recognized here. She said she could courier it overnight. I cross-referenced the dates Anna gave me with Harper's bank activity that I could access through shared accounts and with timestamps on photos Harper had posted. There was a cluster of cash deposits in the weeks after her return, little envelopes of money that matched the period Anna had named. I compared the name on the certificate to the social media tags and found frequent interactions with a Mateo Vargas. The pieces fit into a timeline: the trip, the certificate, the deposits, the cash windfall. It was no longer rumor. It was a lead that needed tidying and a chain of custody. I spent evenings reading statutes and county rules with a lamp on and a legal pad open. I learned the hard way that foreign marriage certificates can be recognized here if they are apostilled, and that recognition gives a county registrar cause to refuse a new license if an existing marriage is evidenced. That meant I had a path. If I could get a certified, apostilled copy into the hands of the right official at the right moment, the license could be halted. I also found language about fraud. Marriages entered into for the purpose of obtaining residency can bring immigration-related charges, and that is something federal investigators take seriously. I called the county clerk's office anonymously first, posing as an interested guest and confirming a procedural detail. The registrar can pause license issuance if presented with credible evidence of a prior marriage. I needed confirmation of names and dates and the insight that a public official would treat such evidence with weight. Then I dialed a legal helpline to get a sense of what chain of custody would look like, and that's where Erin Price, the assistant district attorney, entered the map. Erin was careful and direct. She explained what sort of certified documents and notarized statements would strengthen any investigatory referral. She didn't promise prosecutions, she promised process. I sketched the agencies I might touch. The county registrar who could halt a license, the assistant district attorney for potential local charges, and the federal office that handles immigration-related fraud to look into cross-border issues. I learned how evidence might pass from local to federal hands and what my role would be in that transfer. That clarity made my plan less a fantasy and more a series of steps I could take. It also taught me about chain of custody. How a document must travel, who signs for it, what stamps it needs. I wrote the names and phone numbers on a small card and perhaps for the first time in my life felt like I had a spine to my strategy. Getting the documents without alerting Harper required care and low-profile work. Anna secured a certified copy of the civil marriage certificate and told me the registry clerk had no idea who I was. She paid the official fee, got the signature, and sent the record with an apostille, which made it a legitimate, recognized document. When the courier arrived, Anna handed the packet to Lisa at a neutral location, coffee shop, table by the window, so there would be no paper trail that traced back to me. I watched Lisa tuck the envelope into her bag like it was a fragile thing, and I asked her to store a scanned copy on an external hard drive she kept at her apartment. The packet included the certificate with signatures and the apostille stamp, but it also had small details that mattered: the exact dates, a municipal clerk stamp, and a fee receipt matching Harper's return dates. I cross-checked those with bank transactions that showed cash deposits into Harper's account. I couldn't lawfully access some records, but I kept receipts and screenshots where I could. I also found old email headers on a family laptop I had access to once, messages to a fixer about documents for residency, and printed them with visible header lines showing times and server information. I annotated each printout, noting where it came from and why it mattered. I treated the papers themselves like delicate instruments. I scanned everything into 2 encrypted drives, one Lisa kept and one I stored at a safe deposit box. We made backups on physical drives labeled in a code only we understood, and also uploaded an encrypted copy to a secure cloud folder with a traceable access log. I didn't post anything publicly. I did not tell Harper or Mom or anyone likely to tip them off. The more discreet we were, the more unassailable the chain of custody would be. If anything needed to be handed to officials, it would be clean, sealed, and professionally certified. Lisa and I methodically built the support a legal process needs. Lisa sat with me and wrote a plain language memo that summarized each piece of evidence and why it mattered. We labeled exhibits A through H. The apostilled certificate, the municipal fee receipt, the bank deposit timeline, the email header to the fixer, the seamstress's change order, screenshots of social posts, and so on. I called the seamstress and asked her gently to email me the date Harper changed the dress contract to her name. She complied, and the email became Exhibit C. I also reached out to Sophie, posing as someone conducting a routine vendor survey, and recorded the dates she had CC'd Harper on vendor communications, which confirmed the planner's awareness of the swap. I asked the florist to write an affidavit detailing Mom's statements about my instability and how that influenced the florist's decision to change orders. It took cajoling. Small businesses fear lawsuits and publicity. The florist agreed to a short factual statement, dates, quotes, and a description of what was said. I saved voicemail backups where Mom said I wasn't mentally fit to plan, and I noted the timestamps. Those voicemails were messy pieces of life, but in court they turn into context. I made copies and had them certified as recordings with metadata intact. I also prepared my own sworn statement to narrate the timeline from my perspective. I kept it short and precise, listing dates and exhibits, and had it notarized on the morning I planned to act. That notarized statement gave my claim weight beyond a personal narrative. It established what I personally knew and when I knew it. I ran the plan by Lisa as if she were a prosecutor. She tested the order of evidence and the clarity of each point. We rehearsed how the registrar might respond and what the next official steps could be. There was no storytelling in those rehearsals, just sequences and contingencies. When the documents were finally organized and labeled, the packet looked like something that could not be waved away by pity or family stories. It was factual, tidy, and ready to be handed to someone who had the power to stop a wedding from becoming a legal lie. I reserved a parking spot by the service entrance through a catering contact who owed me a favor from a corporate event I'd managed. The idea was not dramatic entry, it was access. I didn't want to be stopped in the lobby or screened by the kind of security who assumes the unstable woman belongs outside. I planned to slip in quietly with staff, take the corridor that led to the registrar, and place the envelope on the table before anyone realized. I prepared 2 sealed envelopes, one for Janet, thick with original documents and the apostle, and a second that linked to an encrypted folder for the assistant district attorney with contact information and exhibit references. Lisa would keep the second one ready to send if Janet needed electronic copies. We had practiced the handoff so many times that the motion felt as familiar as crossing the street. I set timing cues down to the minute. I cued a 10-minute alarm on my phone to go off as the processional music started, giving me a small buffer for the half-walk I planned. If Janet was late or absent, I would trigger a timed email to Aaron Price, the assistant district attorney, and to Ryan Cole, the federal investigator we'd quietly contacted who specialized in immigration-related fraud. That email had a red receipt and an instruction: if unread after 5 minutes of the ceremony start, deliver the evidence to the registrar. The plan was redundant by design, multiple routes to ensure the packet reached someone with authority to stop signatures. I rehearsed walking into the hall, placing the envelope, saying nothing, and walking back out. The rehearsal felt sterile and necessary. I'd practiced keeping my face expressionless until the moment the registrar took the documents. To avoid surprises, I also confirmed that venue security could not forcibly remove me once I engaged the registrar with evidence. The event contract made clear that license matters are civil and administrative, not the kind of disturbance that grounds staff would eject without cause. That legal detail mattered because it would prevent an overeager security guard from turning a procedural pause into a physical confrontation. I triple-checked the apostille and the notary seal so nothing could be dismissed on a technicality. The last thing I wanted was for a clerk to shrug because the formatting was wrong or a stamp was missing. Everything had to be clean and undeniable. I staged social positioning and a layer of misinformation to make the family believe I was off the grid. I stopped posting on social media and let the narrative of me laying low solidify. Women at brunch and a cousin's check-in gave their version of my weekend away. I RSVP'd with no response to avoid alerting any visible guest list watchers. The fewer visible clues I gave, the more they'd assume I was absent, dissuading anyone from expecting my interference. I texted Dad the day before and wrote, "I won't be anywhere near the venue," knowing he would likely repeat it to Mom. It's amazing how one sentence from a parent can echo more convincingly than your own absence. I unfroze my vendor cards briefly to capture final charges that tied Harper's event to my expenditures, then secured them again. That traceability mattered. I rerouted mail to a P.O. box for the week so no official notices or suspicious envelopes could be intercepted by a family member with access to the house. I told a cousin I was hiking and she posted a photo with a false geotag. My alibi, small and absurd, gave me the cover I needed. The story I built was the opposite of theatrics. It was a vacuum of information where the family's assumptions could settle into complacency. The more they believed I wouldn't show, the easier it would be to deliver the documents unnoticed and let the law speak. Emotional discipline was as much a part of the plan as paperwork. I practiced the walk through my hallway at home, timing my steps, testing the exact fold of the envelope in my hand. I rehearsed breathing so my face stayed neutral, no flushed cheeks, no ragged tone, no optic cues for pity. I wrote 3 lines I could say if cornered. This is the documentation. I want the registrar to review it, and I'll provide contact details if needed. I refused to add narrative. Any background would be weaponized. The cost of that discipline was high. I accepted I would feel the sting of being called cold or heartless by people who could not see the planning that made my action possible. I committed to not texting Jason, not calling Mom, and not engaging with Harper. When the impulse to reach out rose, I wrote drafts and then shredded them. It felt oddly ceremonial, feeding feelings into paper and burning the possibility of impulsive acts. Practically, discipline meant sleep in short bursts, small meals that wouldn't leave me sluggish, and water on hand to steady the throat. I avoided alcohol because any fuzziness could be fatal to timing. I kept a legal pad by my bed with a single list: immediate actions if the registrar accepted the documents, names to call, exhibits to confirm, lawyers to alert. I also accepted I might lose people. Friends whose support depended on my being the compliant daughter would be uncomfortable with public legal action. That was a cost I placed on a list and checked off. I told myself the trade-off was sovereignty over my life. The mental work of cutting out old patterns felt like scab removal, necessary and stinging. Final checks and red teaming felt almost ritualistic. Lisa role-played Janet, Mom, and Pastor Henry in quick succession, firing questions at me. What if she calls security? What if Harvard's folder is challenged? What if someone accuses you of grandstanding? We mapped responses that cut to the bone of procedure and avoided emotion. I triple-checked that the apostille was pristine, that the notary's seal matched the registry format, and that the certified copy's signature line was intact. I verified the venue's layout on the event map and walked the route from service door to registrar in my head until it felt blindfolded. I tested camera batteries and set the little recorder Lisa would tuck into her bag to airplane mode except for the moment she needed to film. We set a time-delayed email to Aaron Price and Ryan Cole with a contingency instruction. If Janet didn't appear within 5 minutes of the start, deliver the packet. I also prepared a failsafe. If Janet had been replaced or if an official refused to review documents without a supervisor, Lisa would send the digital copies to Aaron and to the federal investigator. We made sure every route had a logging mechanism so the chain of custody remained intact. I wrote every contact number on a small card and tucked it in my shoe, practical and almost laughable, but I trusted the small, ridiculous things. The entire plan had been stress-tested until it no longer felt like whim, it felt inevitable. On the day, I parked at the service door and slipped in with a catering trolley, moving with purpose and the low-key gait of someone who belongs. The hall smelled of peonies and lemon oil, and the floral arch, that floral arch I'd chosen and paid for, loomed at the far end, its roses like an accusation. I stood at the back for a moment, feeling the music vibrate through the floorboards. Guests rose as the processional began, the air filled with a hush that felt like a held breath. Harper came down the aisle wrapped in my dress, and for a second the scene looked like something from an old memory I'd never asked to share. I waited until she reached the halfway mark where her face softened and she smiled in that practiced way, and then I moved. My black dress was simple, unadorned, practical clothing for an act that could not be dramatic. I walked with quiet steps, the click of my flats echoing softly on polished tile. Lisa stood near a pillar, inconspicuous, the camera angled toward the registrar's table. I felt every eye in the room like a small needle, but I had rehearsed how to let it pass without flinching. I approached the registrar's table, placed the sealed envelope on the ledger with both hands, and laid down my driver's license and the notarized statement. My hands were steady. I said to Janet, "You need to see this before any license is issued." and then I stepped back 2 paces and folded my hands because the rest would have to be carried by the seals and the stamps. "You need to see this before any license is issued," I said, and my voice felt calm inside my chest. There was no tremor because I'd rehearsed being still. Janet adjusted her glasses, checked the notary seal, and then, as if running an internal checklist, she tapped her lapel mic and said, "Hold, please. We need to pause." Her words were procedural, heavy with authority. She turned the paper toward her monitor and began typing. I watched the light on her keyboard blink like a metronome. She asked for a couple of identification pieces, and I handed her a photocopy of the apostille, the original receipt from the registry, and the printed emails that linked dates to Harper's travels. Janet's eyes flicked to the notarized statement, to the seamstress's email I'd labeled Exhibit C, and then back to me as if collecting permission to escalate. I gave her the contact card for Aaron Price and Ryan Cole because the packet needed more hands if it was to be complete. Her jaw tightened a little. I felt the room tilt on a hinge toward seriousness. Janet put the envelope under a clear plastic sleeve and stamped a time on the top page. That small, bureaucratic motion folded my private efforts into public procedure. She spoke into her mic again. "We are going to hold off on issuing any marriage license at this time." The sound system carried it, and the words landed across the hall like the first clear strike in an argument that had been building for months. I stepped back and folded my hands. The rest belonged to the seals, the signatures, and the slow, inevitable work of law. When the registrar made the call official, the hush in the hall sharpened. Pastor Henry looked over as if sensing a long-held stage direction had been interrupted. He closed his book and searched the faces in front of him. Guests murmured into phones and to each other. The violinists faltered, the bow of the second violinist hovering. Security moved with the controlled firmness of people who have learned how to keep events orderly, and they formed a soft barrier around the registrar's table. Mom, whose voice always found a center in rooms, started forward with that small, determined step she uses when something must be managed. An usher moved to intercept, and Mom's expression shifted for the first time I can remember. She looked as if she'd met a rule that did not submit to her charm. Sophie mouthed, "Who did this?" at one of the ushers, and then caught my eye as if trying to blame me for a drama I had not created for show. Her mouth made the motion, and I saw Lisa's camera catch the exact moment. I didn't look back at her. Instead, I watched Harper, whose face had gone from expectant to pale, and Michael, who had taken an involuntary step away as if the ground beneath him had become uncertain. Parents whispered, a ring of people drawing closer like a ripple. Someone in the second row stood up and fumbled for their phone. Another guest, older and more certain, said aloud, "Is this really happening?" as if asking whether the world had rearranged itself. Janet asked Harper to step aside for a private conversation. Harper hesitated and then refused, her voice slipping into a small panic I'd never wanted to give her. "No, this is my wedding," she said, loud enough to be heard. Janet placed the certificate on the desk and said, "Ma'am, I need to verify before signatures are given." Michael looked like he wanted to say something and could not find the line between loyalty and truth. The word bigamy, which until then had been an abstract legal term I'd read under lamps in quiet hours, suddenly hit the aisle like a dropped plate. The guests recorded. The murmur became a steady hum of phones and whispers. A uniformed security guard moved closer to Mom when she tried to cross the barrier, and for the first time she had a look I'd never seen, one not of disdain but of surprise. The space between her and authority had shifted. The unraveling was not instantaneous, but it was precise. Janet called a supervisor and spoke in the clipped, official tones they use when an incident requires documentation. "There is potentially evidence of a prior marriage," she said, and the supervisor told her what steps to take. A protocol list unfurled: "Do not allow signatures, document the packet, contact the office of the assistant district attorney." Someone whispered, "Immigration fraud," and the word skittered. Harper's lips moved without sound for a moment as she read the paper that sat before her like an accusation. Michael's hand landed on her elbow, not to restrain but to steady himself. He looked at me, then at the paper, and his face read shock and something like betrayal. People around us shifted toward gossip in small clusters, women whose dresses had been chosen in one sitting, a group of family friends who loved weddings and the business of them. Some faces were sympathetic to Mom and Harper. Others were just confused, eyes widening as if a story they had watched unfold on a Sunday had suddenly become true in the middle of their brunch. A man in a suit near the back whispered, "This is legal trouble," and 2 rows ahead a teen whispered to her friend, "Isn't that the girl who is going to marry that Jason?" The gossip web tightened in real time, but my work was not gossip. It was the deliberate presentation of recorded facts. I felt the air around me change from performance to procedure. Harper hissed, "You ruined my day," and the words snapped like small, brittle glass. I let them land. I did not smile in triumph. Who would have wanted that? Instead I said, "You stole my life," and the sentence was not shrill. It was slow, calibrated, a factual line with no theatrics. People heard it as if a bell had rung. Mom, who had been about to speak, inhaled and then stopped. She opened her mouth to repeat the old line, "Olivia is unstable," and I cut her off quietly and precisely. "The evidence is stable." The sentence felt like seat belt click, calm, binding. I turned to Michael because he had the right to know. He had not been told the whole picture. "You deserve informed consent," I said. "You did not have it." His eyes met mine for the briefest second, and I saw regret unspool like a thread. I looked at Pastor Henry and said, "Thank you for pausing. That was the right call." There was no gloat in the gratitude. I did not want to celebrate the fall of a plan that had once been imagined as a happy day. I wanted the law to have its moment because it is a clean thing in the face of deceit. I nodded to Janet and gave her my contact details, and she said, "We will be in touch." Her tone carried the weight of procedure, and my voice remained measured. I did not argue with Mom about intent. I did not beg Harper to explain herself. This moment was not for unburdening, it was for recording. I had done the work to make truth audible. If anyone wanted persuasion, they could take it up with a court or an investigator. In that room, with cameras turning and phones raised, the registrar had done her job. I walked out the side aisle as people made a small, awkward corridor for me. The click of my flats on tile sounded loud in my ears. Guests stepped aside, some with eyes widened or mouths open, others with polite indifference. It felt like passing through a storm where the weather followed me in every face. Outside, Lisa handed me a bottle of water without immediate words. We didn't hug until we were around the corner, out of sight of the crowd. When we did, it was brief and solid, the kind of connection that says, "We did it without a spectacle." I sent a text to Aaron Price, "It's done. Janet has the packet." I watched the 3 dots bob for a second and then disappear. She was typing an acknowledgement. I triggered the timed email with attached scans to the assistant district attorney and to the federal investigator, and Lisa sent a clean backup to her secure drive. I blocked Mom and Harper on every channel I could think of, phone, text, social, because I needed a clean line between what happened and their next moves. Blocking felt trivial in the face of courts, but it was practical for my headspace. We left without looking triumphant. I didn't want triumph, I wanted a different kind of quiet. On the drive away, the city slid by in a stream of light and shadow. Lisa and I talked in short sentences, filling in the practical next steps. Who to call, which exhibits to confirm, what to say if anyone from the press reached out. I called Dad later that evening. He left a message that was the size of apology and regret. I did not answer immediately. I allowed myself a slow, controlled breathing pattern, and then I sat with the fact that silence had become sovereignty. I had not screamed, I had not cried in the hall, I had not begged for understanding. I had placed documents on a table and let the law do the work. That was the way I wanted to leave. Aaron Price, the assistant district attorney, asked me to come in for an interview and to bring originals. I handed her the envelopes, watched as she verified the apostille and the municipal clerk's stamp. Aaron explained what could happen next in plain language: an administrative hold on the attempted license issuance, potential state-level charges related to bigamy where applicable, and a referral to federal authorities if immigration-related fraud seemed likely. She asked for more exhibits, bank statements, and the fixer email headers, and I gave them. I didn't dramatize anything. I answered questions with dates and times and names. It felt odd to talk about betrayal like a ledger, but that was the point. The ledger is what held weight. Harper received a notice to appear for questioning, and Michael told acquaintances he needed clarity and put their engagement on hold. Friends of his who had been in the pew with us that day messaged me, half apologetic and half bewildered, asking if I'd expected things to go that way. The paper trail of cash deposits that Anna had identified tied closely enough to the municipal receipt that investigators took it seriously. The fixer emails, the apostle, the notarized statement stacked together, they weren't dramatic accusations, they were a pattern that demanded answers. When the word charges entered our family group chat, it landed like a stone. It was the first time the conversation had to move from petty squabbles to legal realities. People who had once cheered at brunch now read articles about bigamy and immigration fraud with a new, brittle attention. Mom's reaction to the legal fallout was not theatrical. She made phone calls that were terse and controlled at first, then increasingly defensive. Vendors began demanding payment for lost deposits and transferred services. The family account Mom had used to smooth over contracts showed a flurry of charges and then a low balance, and suddenly the cancellation penalties were not abstract, they were her bill. The florist texted that their account had invoices that were past due. The seamstress sent a list of alteration charges that no one had contested. Sophie, who had reassured clients with soft voices, started answering fewer calls and sending more secure messages that read like damage control. She told vendors to route payment disputes to Mom's card, and when checks bounced, they came back to Mom's doorstep. Off record, some vendors offered statements that could be used to support a civil claim. The florist admitted in a quiet message that Mom's insistence I was fragile influenced how they handled orders. The seamstress confirmed she'd been told to alter my fitting to Harper and added dates. Those messages mattered in a different register than the criminal inquiry. They were evidence of a pattern of behavior that could expose defamation and financial liability. Mom tried to reframe things publicly, posting short, polished messages about family unity and difficult decisions, but screenshots of the apostilled certificate and copies of the bank receipts made that spin fragile. Relatives who had sat sipping coffee at the brunch began asking tougher questions in private messages. The group chat that used to host recipe swaps split into subthreads. Some relatives expressed sympathy for my position, others clung to Mom's framing. The social map of the family changed by phone call and text. One moment stands out. Mom called Dad's company picnic to complain about how people were talking. Human resources at his workplace, who did not want workday drama, asked Dad to keep matters personal. He came home with that look he has, the mixture of regret and relief that comes from someone who had hoped silence would keep the peace. Mom's public persona, always smooth and unassailable, now carried a bill and a stain. She tried press statements early, terse, and procedural, but reporters prefer stories that have documents and witnesses, and the documents were already out of the bag. Money and narrative are both forms of accountability. She discovered both can be withdrawn. Dad reached out with something steadier than the storm of our family chat. He asked to meet in a public park, which I accepted because it felt safer than anything at the house. He sat on a bench in a cardigan that looked too small and handed me a thin stack of printed vendor contracts he'd retrieved from the house. There was no theatrical apology, just a quiet, I should have done more. He told me he'd been afraid to contradict Mom because of the way she reacted, and the fear had calcified into silence. He said, "I'm sorry I didn't protect you," and I listened. He didn't make excuses, which is all I wanted. He'd felt the cost of his quiet complicity and for the first time named it. Dad gave me copies of my original contracts and receipts he'd found in drawers, things Mom had thought were private. He'd been the one slipping me gas money and saying, "Give it time," and now he was giving the leverage he could, proof. I told him clearly what I needed if he wanted to help, not heroics but a straightforward set of commitments. No triangulating messages, no calling people on my behalf without my explicit consent, and if asked, tell the truth out loud. He agreed. He started with small things, texting a cousin to correct a rumor, replying honestly to an aunt's question about what had happened. It was a small pivot, but it mattered. My boundaries were not about punishment. They were a condition of any future participation he or mom might have in my life. The community's response to what happened around the registrar was uneven but notable. People who had once overlooked me began to ask careful questions and listen to short, factual answers. Some relatives sent messages that read, "I didn't realize," and others said plainly, "I'm sorry." I accepted apologies without hosting the apologiers. Saying thank you was sufficient. At work, my manager called me, composed under pressure, in a team meeting after hearing a brief synopsis. The compliment landed like a card I could file away for later. The story traveled outside the family, too. Neighbors mentioned the halted wedding in the grocery store aisle, and at the climbing gym, a woman I knew only by nod sent a message, "Saw what happened. If you ever need anything, I'm here." Those small shifts felt like repair. Jason emailed a month later, "I'm sorry, I didn't respond." The silence on my end was not cruelty, it was finality. He had chosen a retreat that I had no room for anymore. The community's reframing of me went quietly from emotionally fragile to someone who provided proof, and that is a shift that does not invite lopsided sympathy. People began to count evidence rather than rumors. The word unstable lost its persuasive power not because I argued but because the registrar, the assistant district attorney, and federal attention replaced opinion with records. I didn't rebuild the old life. I built a new one. I sold the dress credit to a buyer who gave me cash and then used that money to book a solo trip to a small coastal town where the waves had nothing to say about family politics. For the first time in years, I did not post the trip on social media. I packed without photographing. I joined a weekly climbing group where the climbing routes are direct and honest. Either you find a hold or you don't. That physical work felt cleansing. You plant your feet and decide your next move. I updated my will. It was a practical exercise that felt like accepting adulthood fully. I named Lisa as a medical decision maker if needed and kept Dad in with conditions. I stopped performing the role of the accommodating daughter and started choosing people who respected boundaries. I moved to a light-filled apartment with large windows and a lock I felt ownership of. I bought plants and learned how to keep them alive as a daily small miracle. I put a fire-safe box on a high shelf and labeled it in a quiet hand, "When they say you're unstable." In it went the apostle copy, the seamstress emails, receipts, and a spare set of keys to the car. I booked therapy sessions and kept my therapist's number handy, not as a shield but as a tool for growth. I didn't want to be defined by the fight anymore. I wanted to be defined by what I could build when the noise stopped. The change was less about revenge than sovereignty. I didn't want Mom to be shamed into silence. I wanted my agency back. Blocking Mom and Harper on all channels felt trivial and also vital. Sometimes clean breaks are the strongest boundaries we can set. I kept working, kept saving, and kept my documents organized in a way that made me feel stable. I stopped expecting apologies and started expecting truth. That attitude created a life that didn't depend on their approval to function. If your family rewrote your life, tell me in the comments. I read them. Subscribe and turn on notifications for more true-to-life revenge arcs where control, not chaos, wins. Keep listening, another takedown is already queued.